My father once told me over breakfast, stirring his coffee with the precision of a man who measured everything twice. Some people are born to lead, Michael. Others are born to follow. There's no shame in knowing which one you are. He said it like he was giving me directions to the grocery store, matter of fact and final. I was 22, fresh out of what he called my maritime phase at the Coast Guard Academy, sitting in the same kitchen where I'd eaten cereal before school for 18 years. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The difference was, this time I wasn't coming back. My mother, Patricia, nodded from her spot at the sink, her silence heavier than agreement. She dried the same plate 3 times while my father delivered his verdict. They'd made up their minds about me long before that morning, probably somewhere between my 3rd year of what they called playing sailor and the day I came home without the commission they'd expected. See, the Fletcher family had a tradition. Not the kind you read about in history books, but the kind that gets whispered at country club dinners and written into alumni newsletters. My grandfather, Judge Harrison Fletcher, had built a legal dynasty in Charleston, South Carolina. His portrait hung in the courthouse foyer, stern eyes following every defendant who walked through those doors. My father, Judge William Fletcher, had inherited not just the bench but the expectation that excellence flowed through our bloodline like expensive wine. My older brother, David, had fulfilled that prophecy perfectly. Harvard Law, summa cum laude, followed by a partnership at Morrison, Kessler and Associates before his 30th birthday. He drove a Mercedes, lived in a historic district townhouse, and had married Caroline Whitmore, whose family owned half the commercial real estate downtown. David was the son who made sense, the one whose accomplishments fit neatly into Christmas card updates and charity auction bios. Then there was my younger sister Rebecca, who'd graduated valedictorian from Duke, and was already making waves as a federal prosecutor. She specialized in white-collar crime, the kind of cases that made the evening news and impressed dinner party guests. Rebecca had inherited our father's sharp mind and our mother's ability to devastate opponents with a smile. And then there was me. Michael Fletcher, the one who'd chosen water over words, ships over suits, and a life they couldn't understand over one they could showcase. I'd always been drawn to the ocean, not in some romantic poetic way that people write about in novels, but in a bone-deep understanding that I belonged somewhere vast and unforgiving. While David was winning debate tournaments and Rebecca was organizing student government, I was reading maritime law textbooks and studying weather patterns. I built model ships in my bedroom, not as toys but as precise replicas, each one teaching me something new about hull design or navigation. My parents tolerated it the way you tolerate a child's obsession with dinosaurs, assuming I'd outgrow it when real life started calling. When I announced my intention to attend the Coast Guard Academy, the disappointment in our house was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. My father didn't speak to me for 3 days. My mother made worried phone calls to relatives, as if my choice was a medical condition requiring intervention. But I'd gone anyway, and for 4 years I'd thrived in ways that had nothing to do with family expectations. I understood maritime law not just as regulations but as a living system that governed everything from international shipping disputes to environmental protection. I excelled in navigation, maritime safety, and something that fascinated me more than anything else: the intricate world of international maritime commerce and the legal frameworks that made global trade possible. The problem was, none of that translated into success by Fletcher family standards. When I graduated, I didn't receive a traditional military commission that my family could brag about. Instead, I'd been recruited into something else entirely. Something so specialized and confidential that I couldn't explain it even if I'd wanted to. The official story was that I'd washed out of the traditional track and was working for a maritime consulting firm in Norfolk, Virginia. Which is how I found myself back in Charleston for what my mother called a family discussion, but felt more like an intervention. "The Henderson boy just made partner at his firm," my mother said, still polishing that same plate. "He's younger than you, Michael. And the Whitfield girl. You remember her from church. She's arguing cases before the Fourth Circuit already." My father leaned back in his chair the same way he did before delivering a sentence from the bench. "Son, we've given you time to figure this out. But at some point, you need to accept reality. This maritime consulting work, it's not building toward anything. It's not a career. It's a delay. The weight of their disappointment settled over the breakfast table, like fog rolling in from the harbor. This wasn't new. For the past 3 years, every phone call home had carried undertones of concern and pity. Every family gathering included subtle questions about my real plans and worried glances when relatives asked what I did for work. They saw a son who'd failed to launch, who'd chosen an uncertain path in a world they didn't understand. They saw someone who worked for a company they'd never heard of, who couldn't explain his day-to-day responsibilities, who lived in a modest apartment in Norfolk, instead of a prestigious address they could mention at cocktail parties. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was that their disappointment had become my armor. Every dismissive comment, every worried conversation about my future, every time they introduced me to their friends with the phrase, "This is our son Michael, he's still figuring things out," only strengthened my resolve to prove that success couldn't be measured by their standards alone. The irony was devastating. While they worried about my lack of direction, I was building something they couldn't fathom. While they questioned my choices, I was making decisions that affected international trade routes worth billions of dollars. While they saw failure, I was succeeding in ways that would have astonished them if security clearances and classified operations allowed for family dinner conversation. But that morning in Charleston, sitting in the kitchen where I'd been measured and found wanting since childhood, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to stop trying to make them understand and start preparing for the day when understanding would be forced upon them. I finished my coffee, stood up from the table, and looked at both my parents with the calm that comes from knowing something they didn't. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice steady, "but I'm exactly where I need to be." My father's expression suggested he was already composing the speech he'd give to explain my stubborn refusal to see reason. My mother's face crumpled slightly, as if I'd just confirmed her worst fears about my future. Neither of them could have imagined that in 18 months, that same kitchen would witness a conversation that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about their middle child. They couldn't have predicted that my father's own courtroom would become the stage for a revelation that would force them to confront not just their misjudgment, but the dangerous assumptions they'd made about success, family, and the invisible work that keeps the world running safely. The truth was, I wasn't working for a maritime consulting firm in Norfolk. I was working 3 floors beneath it. The Maritime Security Operations Center occupied a space that didn't exist on any public building directory, accessible only through a service elevator that required both a keycard and biometric scan. My official title was Deputy Director of International Maritime Intelligence, but even that was a sanitized version of what I actually did. The real work happened in rooms where the walls were lined with monitors displaying shipping routes, satellite feeds, and intercept communications from vessels whose cargo manifests told only half the story. Every morning at 0500, I received briefings that would have given my father nightmares. Drug trafficking networks using legitimate shipping companies as cover, arms dealers moving weapons through commercial ports, human trafficking operations disguised as cargo containers filled with textiles, foreign governments using merchant vessels to conduct espionage. The ocean that most people saw as endless blue was actually a highway for every form of international crime imaginable. My job was to see the patterns that others missed, to identify the connections between seemingly legitimate maritime businesses and the criminal enterprises they enabled. It required understanding not just maritime law, but international banking regulations, customs protocols, and the complex web of shell companies that made illegal cargo appear legal on paper. 3 years earlier, I'd been handpicked for this position straight out of the Coast Guard Academy by Admiral Catherine Morrison, who'd seen something in my maritime law thesis that impressed her enough to offer me a job that didn't officially exist. My academic paper on international shipping compliance had identified 17 regulatory loopholes that criminal organizations could exploit. Instead of publishing my findings, Admiral Morrison had classified them and offered me the chance to help close those loopholes from the inside. The secrecy wasn't just about protecting operations. It was about protecting lives. The criminal networks we tracked had killed people for far less than what I knew about their operations. My identity as a federal maritime intelligence officer was buried so deep that even most Coast Guard personnel didn't know my unit existed. To the outside world, I was exactly what my family believed. A failed academy graduate working for a private consulting firm. The irony was that, while my family worried about my lack of career prospects, I was earning more than David's starting salary at his prestigious law firm. While they questioned my decision to choose the maritime industry, I was preventing international incidents that could have disrupted global commerce. While they saw me as aimless, I was part of a select team responsible for securing American ports and protecting international shipping lanes. But the personal cost was higher than any salary could compensate for. I missed my nephew's first birthday because I was in Rotterdam, working with Dutch authorities to intercept a cargo ship carrying weapons disguised as agricultural equipment. The operation took 18 days of surveillance and resulted in the arrest of 12 members of an arms trafficking ring that had been operating for 6 years. I couldn't tell my family why I'd missed the party. I sent a gift and apologized for being tied up with work. I missed Rebecca's engagement celebration because I was testifying in a closed federal hearing about a human trafficking network that had been using luxury yachts to transport victims between Caribbean islands and Florida ports. My testimony helped secure convictions for 14 defendants and rescued 43 victims. My family thought I'd chosen work over family again. They couldn't know that 43 people were alive because I'd chosen work over family. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. I missed Christmas dinner 2 years running because December was when most smuggling operations tried to exploit holiday shipping schedules and reduced port security. While my family gathered around our childhood dinner table, I was coordinating with international law enforcement agencies to track suspicious cargo movements across 3 continents. The operations we disrupted those Christmases prevented enough illegal drugs from reaching American cities to fill a warehouse, but my empty chair at dinner was just another reminder to my parents that their middle son had his priorities wrong. The hardest part wasn't the missed celebrations or the family disappointment. The hardest part was watching my father struggle to explain my career to his colleagues and friends. Judge William Fletcher, who commanded respect in every courtroom in South Carolina, became tongue-tied when anyone asked about his son's work. He developed a repertoire of vague responses. Michael works in maritime consulting, or, quote, he's involved in shipping logistics, or simply, he's doing well in Virginia. I knew it embarrassed him. I knew he'd practiced better explanations in his head, searching for ways to make my work sound more prestigious or promising. I'd overheard him on phone calls with his brother, my Uncle James, who was also a federal judge. I just don't understand what he's building toward, my father would say. At his age, I was already establishing my reputation. David was making connections that would serve him for decades. But Michael, I can't even explain what he does well enough to recommend him to anyone. My mother tried to be supportive in her own way, but her concern was even more painful than my father's disappointment. She'd started including articles about career changes in her letters, stories about people who'd found success after initial false starts. She'd mention friends' children who'd returned to school for law degrees or business credentials. Her love was obvious, but so was her belief that I was wasting my potential on something that couldn't possibly lead anywhere important. The security clearance that governed my life meant I couldn't correct their assumptions, couldn't ease their worries, couldn't share the recognition I'd received from officials whose names they would have recognized immediately. In my apartment in Norfolk, I kept a collection of commendations that would have made any parent proud. Letters from senators thanking me for briefings that had influenced maritime security legislation, recommendations from international law enforcement agencies, and a personal note from the Secretary of Homeland Security acknowledging my role in preventing what could have been a devastating terrorist attack using a hijacked cargo vessel. My family would never see those letters. They'd never know that their son, who worked for an unnamed consulting firm, had been promoted 3 times in 4 years, that he'd been trusted with operations affecting national security, that he'd earned the respect of career intelligence officers who'd been protecting American interests since before he was born. The promotion to deputy director had come with a different kind of responsibility. I wasn't just analyzing intelligence anymore. I was making operational decisions that affected real-time maritime security across the eastern seaboard. My recommendations influenced port security protocols from Maine to Florida. My risk assessments determined which cargo ships received intensive inspection and which were cleared for expedited processing. But with the new position came an even deeper level of classification. My work now involved coordination with international intelligence agencies, participation in joint operations with foreign governments, and access to information that existed at the highest levels of national security. The gap between what my family believed about my life and what my life actually entailed had grown so wide that bridging it seemed impossible. 3 months after my promotion, I'd received a call from my mother inviting me to David's law firm's annual charity gala. "It's a wonderful networking opportunity," she'd said, her voice bright with hope. "Your father will be there, and several other judges. You could meet people who might help you transition into something more stable." I declined politely, explaining that I had work commitments. What I couldn't tell her was that I'd be spending that weekend in a secure briefing room in Washington, presenting maritime security assessments to a joint committee of senators and intelligence officials. The meeting would influence federal funding for port security initiatives worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But my mother would never know that her son's work commitment was more important than anything happening at David's charity gala. The isolation was becoming unbearable. I was succeeding beyond anything my family could have imagined, but their disappointment was growing deeper with every missed event, every vague explanation, every year that passed without visible progress toward their definition of success. What I didn't know was that everything was about to change. In 6 weeks, my carefully maintained secret would collide with my father's world in a way that neither of us could have predicted. The same security protocols that had kept my family in the dark were about to bring my work directly into my father's courtroom, and the revelation would force all of us to confront not just our assumptions about each other, but the dangerous reality of the work that had been keeping us safe while they worried about my future. The call came at 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, jarring me awake in my Norfolk apartment. Admiral Morrison's voice was crisp despite the hour, carrying the weight of an emergency that couldn't wait for morning briefings. "Fletcher, we need you in Charleston, now." I was already reaching for my clothes. "What's the situation?" "Federal court. Your father's jurisdiction. We have a maritime trafficking case that's about to blow wide open, and someone leaked our investigation to the defense. Judge Fletcher is demanding answers about classified evidence we can't acknowledge exists." My blood turned cold. For 4 years, I'd managed to keep my two worlds completely separate. Now they were colliding in the worst possible way. "Admiral, I need to request reassignment. This is my father's court." "No reassignment, Fletcher. You're the lead case officer on Operation Seahawk. No one else has your level of knowledge about the Castellanos network. You'll maintain your cover, but you'll be in that courtroom as our classified liaison. The Castellanos network." 8 months of my life had gone into dismantling their operation, a sophisticated maritime trafficking ring that used legitimate shipping companies to move everything from weapons to people across the Caribbean. They'd been operating for 12 years, generating over $2 billion in illegal revenue, while maintaining the appearance of a family-owned shipping conglomerate based in Miami. The case had started when our surveillance detected unusual patterns in cargo manifests from vessels owned by Castellanos Maritime Holdings. Ships that should have been carrying coffee beans from Colombia were drawing too much water, suggesting heavier cargo. Vessels supposedly transporting textiles from Guatemala were making unexplained stops at coordinates that corresponded to no official ports. It had taken 6 months of international cooperation to build the case. We'd worked with Colombian authorities to establish surveillance at source ports, coordinated with Coast Guard cutters to track suspicious vessels, and developed a network of informants within the legitimate shipping industry who could identify when normal operations were being exploited for criminal purposes. The breakthrough had come when we intercepted communications between Elena Castellanos, the family matriarch who ran the business side of the operation, and her son Diego, who handled the criminal logistics. They were planning to use their shipping infrastructure to transport not just drugs and weapons, but a human trafficking operation that would have moved over 300 victims through Charleston's port over the course of 2 months. We'd moved fast. Joint raids in Miami, Colombian ports, and 3 vessels at sea had netted 47 arrests and prevented what would have been one of the largest human trafficking operations ever attempted through South Carolina waters. But Elena Castellanos had escaped the initial raids, and her high-powered legal team was now challenging every piece of evidence we'd collected, claiming it was obtained through illegal surveillance of legitimate business operations. The problem was that most of our evidence had been obtained through classified methods that couldn't be disclosed in open court. Our telecommunications intercepts, satellite surveillance, and international intelligence sharing agreements were all protected by national security classifications that made them inadmissible under normal federal court procedures. But Elena Castellanos' lawyers had somehow learned that classified evidence existed, and they were demanding that Judge William Fletcher rule on its admissibility. They were claiming that the government was hiding exculpatory evidence behind national security classifications, and that their clients' constitutional rights were being violated by secret proceedings. My father, following proper legal protocol, had demanded that federal prosecutors provide a government representative who could address the classified evidence issues in camera. What he didn't know was that the representative would be his son. Olaf. I caught the first flight to Charleston, my mind racing through every possible scenario. How would my father react when he saw me walk into his courtroom? How would I maintain operational security while operating under his direct authority? How would our family dynamic affect a case that had taken 8 months to build and could save hundreds of lives if we secured convictions? The federal courthouse in Charleston was a building I'd visited exactly once during a middle school field trip when I was 12 years old. I remember being impressed by the marble columns and the weight of authority that seemed to press down from the high ceilings. Now, walking through those same halls with a classified briefcase handcuffed to my wrist, the building felt entirely different. I was escorted to a secure conference room where the federal prosecution team was preparing for what they expected to be a devastating hearing. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Martinez looked up as I entered, her expression shifting from relief to confusion. "You're our classified liaison? You look like you're about 12 years old." I set the briefcase on the table and introduced myself using my operational cover. Deputy Director Fletcher, Maritime Security Operations. I've been the lead case officer on the Castellanos investigation since its inception. Martinez's eyebrows shot up. Fletcher? As in Judge Fletcher. That's correct. Jesus Christ, does he know? He will, in about 30 minutes. The prosecution team exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering their career choices. The lead prosecutor, U.S. Attorney Benjamin Torres, leaned forward with the expression of a man who just realized his case had become infinitely more complicated. "Can you brief us on what we can and cannot disclose about the classified evidence?" I spent the next 20 minutes explaining the parameters of our investigation, the national security implications of revealing our sources and methods, and the legal framework that governed the disclosure of classified information in federal court proceedings. What I couldn't tell them was that my stomach was churning with the anticipation of walking into my father's courtroom and watching his world collide with mine. At 9:45 a.m., I followed the prosecution team through the courthouse corridors toward Courtroom 4A Federal Judge William Fletcher's domain. The same man who'd worried about my career prospects over breakfast 3 months earlier was about to discover that his son held security clearances he'd never imagined and was responsible for investigations that affected international criminal justice. The courtroom was exactly as I remembered from that childhood field trip. Imposing wooden panels, the American flag positioned behind the judge's bench, rows of gallery seating that could accommodate significant public interest. Today, those seats were filled with reporters, legal observers, and family members of the human trafficking victims, whose lives depended on our ability to make this case stick. Elena Castellanos sat at the defense table, a woman in her 60s, whose grandmother's appearance masked a criminal mind that had orchestrated human misery on an industrial scale. Her legal team occupied an entire row of chairs, each attorney armed with briefcases full of motions designed to dismantle our case through procedural challenges. I took my seat at the prosecution table, my back to the gallery, and waited for my father to take the bench. When the bailiff called the court to order and announced, "The Honorable Judge William Fletcher presiding," I stood with everyone else and prepared for the moment that would change everything between us. My father entered with the measured dignity that characterized all his public appearances, his black robes flowing as he moved toward the bench. He was reviewing case files as he walked, his attention focused on the legal issues he was about to address rather than the people in his courtroom. "Be seated," he said, settling into his chair and looking up for the first time. Our eyes met across 30 feet of courtroom space, and I watched my father's professional composure crack for just a moment. His expression shifted from judicial authority to parental confusion to something approaching shock. He recovered quickly, years of courtroom experience allowing him to mask his surprise, but I saw the questions forming behind his eyes. "Counsel," he said, his voice steady despite what must have been internal chaos, "I understand we have matters of classified evidence to address in camera before we proceed with today's hearing." Torres stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The government requests an in-camera conference to address the admissibility of classified materials relevant to this case. We have our designated security representative present." My father's eyes found mine again. "And that representative is?" I stood, my voice carrying across the courtroom with a clarity that surprised me. "Deputy Director Michael Fletcher, Maritime Security Operations Center, Your Honor." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my father's breathing, could see his mind working through the implications of what he'd just heard. In the gallery behind me, I sensed movement as reporters and observers tried to process why the judge's son was apparently a federal security official. My father's training took over. Whatever personal questions were racing through his mind, his professional obligations demanded that he maintain courtroom decorum and address the legal issues before him. "Counsel will approach for an in-camera conference," he said, his voice betraying nothing of the personal earthquake that had just occurred. As I walked toward the bench, briefcase in hand, I realized that the next hour would either vindicate every choice I'd made in the past 4 years, or destroy the case that had consumed 8 months of my life. Either way, my father was about to learn that his son, who worked for a consulting firm in Norfolk, was actually protecting American ports from international criminals. The boy he'd worried wasn't building toward anything had been building toward this moment all along. The in-camera conference lasted 3 hours and changed everything. Sitting across from my father in his private chambers, with court reporters sworn to secrecy and defense attorneys bound by protective orders, I laid out 8 months of classified maritime intelligence in methodical detail. I explained how we'd identified the Castellanos network through pattern analysis of shipping manifests, how we'd coordinated with international agencies to track their vessels, and how our investigation had uncovered not just drug and weapons trafficking, but a human trafficking operation that would have moved hundreds of victims through American ports. My father listened without interruption, his judicial training allowing him to compartmentalize the personal shock of learning his son's true profession while focusing on the legal implications of the evidence I was presenting. But I could see the questions building behind his eyes, the same questions that had been haunting our family dinners for 4 years. When I finished my briefing, the defense attorneys immediately moved to have all classified evidence excluded, arguing that their constitutional right to cross-examine witnesses and challenge evidence was being violated by secret proceedings. Elena Castellanos' lead counsel, a former federal prosecutor named Harrison Valdez, was particularly aggressive in his challenge. "Your Honor," Valdez argued, "the government is asking this court to accept evidence that my client cannot examine, obtained through methods that cannot be disclosed, by agencies that cannot be identified. This violates every principle of due process that our legal system is built upon." My father turned to me. "Deputy Director Fletcher, can you address these constitutional concerns while maintaining operational security?" For the first time in 4 years, I was speaking to my father not as his disappointing son, but as a federal official whose expertise he needed to make crucial legal decisions. The role reversal was surreal, but the stakes were too high for personal considerations. "Your Honor, I can provide sufficient detail about our investigative methods to allow for meaningful legal review without compromising ongoing national security operations. The evidence we've gathered is independently corroborated through traditional law enforcement channels that are fully discoverable." What followed was a complex legal dance that lasted until nearly 2 p.m. My father had to balance constitutional protections with national security interests, while I had to provide enough information to justify our evidence, while protecting classified sources and methods. The defense attorneys pressed every advantage, demanding disclosure of information that could have compromised ongoing investigations across 3 countries. Finally, my father made his ruling. The classified evidence would be admitted under the Classified Information Procedures Act, with appropriate protective measures to safeguard national security interests while preserving the defendant's constitutional rights. It was a careful legal balance that satisfied no one completely but protected both the investigation and the legal process. But as court recessed for lunch, I realized that the legal victory was only the beginning of a much larger problem. Elena Castellanos' defense team had clearly been preparing for this moment. They'd known about our classified investigation, they'd known which evidence to challenge, and they'd known exactly which legal arguments would create the most difficulty for the court. Someone had been feeding them information that should have been accessible only to a handful of federal officials with the highest security clearances. Worse, as I reviewed the defense motions during the lunch recess, I found references to operational details that weren't included in any discoverable materials. They knew about surveillance operations in Colombian ports that had never been mentioned in federal court filings. They knew about encrypted communications intercepts that were classified above top secret. They knew about cooperative agreements with foreign intelligence agencies that weren't even acknowledged to exist in public documents. Someone with access to the most sensitive aspects of Operation Seahawk was systematically undermining our case. I called Admiral Morrison from a secure phone in the federal building's basement. "Admiral, we have a leak. The defense knows details about our operation that aren't included in any court filings." "How extensive is the breach?" "They know about the Colombian port surveillance. They know about the NSA communications intercepts. They know about our agreements with British and Dutch intelligence agencies." The silence on the other end lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When Admiral Morrison spoke again, her voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "Fletcher, we're pulling you out. This case is compromised beyond salvage." "Admiral, with respect, we can't abandon this case. We have 300 potential human trafficking victims whose lives depend on these convictions. If we walk away now, Elena Castellanos disappears. Her network continues operating, and those victims become statistics. If we continue with a compromised operation, we risk exposing methods and sources that protect thousands of other potential victims. Sometimes you have to sacrifice one case to preserve the larger mission." I understood her position, but I couldn't accept it. Not when I'd spent 8 months building relationships with confidential informants who'd trusted me with their lives. Not when I'd seen the intelligence reports detailing what happened to victims who were processed through the Castellanos network. Not when I had the chance to prevent human suffering on a scale that would haunt me for the rest of my career. "Admiral, give me 48 hours to identify the source of the leak. If I can't secure the operation, I'll support the decision to withdraw." Another long pause. "You have 24 hours, Fletcher. And if this goes sideways, you'll be the one explaining to congressional oversight committees why we lost the most important maritime trafficking case in a decade." That evening, I found myself in a position I'd never expected, having dinner with my family while conducting a classified leak investigation that could determine the fate of hundreds of human trafficking victims. My mother had insisted on cooking, as if preparing my favorite meal could somehow process the revelation that her son wasn't who she'd thought he was for the past 4 years. My father sat at the head of the table, still in his judicial robes, studying me with the intensity he usually reserved for complex legal briefs. "So," my mother said, passing the mashed potatoes with determined normalcy, "maritime security. That sounds important." The understatement was so profound that I almost laughed. "It's challenging work, Mom. When you said consulting," my father began carefully, "I assumed you meant helping shipping companies with compliance issues." That was the cover story we agreed on. The actual work requires security clearances that make family dinners complicated. Rebecca, who'd driven down from her federal prosecutor's office in Colombia, was studying me with professional interest. "How long have you been operating with classification levels above my clearance?" "Since graduation." David, who'd arrived with Caroline after closing a real estate deal, looked genuinely confused. "So when we thought you were struggling to find direction." "I was running international investigations that you couldn't know existed." The silence that followed was filled with years of accumulated misunderstanding. Every worried conversation about my future, every suggestion that I needed to find more stable work, every family gathering where I'd been the source of quiet concern, all of it based on a fundamental misapprehension of what my life actually entailed. But even as my family struggled to process the revelation, I was analyzing their reactions through the lens of my current crisis. Who had known enough about my work to leak operational details to defense attorneys? Who had access to classified information that could compromise 8 months of investigation? The answer, when it came, was more disturbing than I'd anticipated. My phone buzzed with a secure message from our technical analysis team. They'd traced the leaked information to a breach of federal communication systems that had occurred 3 weeks earlier. The breach had accessed classified databases from multiple agencies, including detailed files on Operation Seahawk. But the breach hadn't come from outside hackers or foreign intelligence services. It had come from someone with legitimate access to federal networks. Someone who'd used valid credentials to download classified files, and then disappeared those files into encrypted channels that led directly to Elena Castellanos' defense team. The investigation was about to reveal not just a leak, but a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. And I was sitting at my childhood dinner table, watching my parents struggle to understand why their son had lied to them for 4 years, while knowing that the next 24 hours would determine whether one of the most important criminal cases of my career would survive or collapse. The boy they'd worried wasn't building toward anything, was about to expose a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of the entire federal justice system. But first I had to figure out how to save a case that someone very powerful wanted to see destroyed. I spent that night in the federal building's Security Operations Center, surrounded by computer screens and case files, hunting for a traitor who could destroy 8 months of work with a few keystrokes. The breach analysis had given me a starting point. The compromised access had occurred during a 3-hour window on March 8th, using credentials belonging to someone with Level 5 maritime security clearance. Only 12 people in the entire federal system had that level of access to Operation Seahawk files. I knew 11 of them personally. The 12th was Deputy Assistant Director Marcus Webb, a 20-year veteran of federal maritime security who'd been assigned to our operation as an oversight liaison from Washington. Webb had impressed everyone with his thorough knowledge of international maritime law and his ability to navigate the complex bureaucracy that governed multi-agency operations. He'd suggested several procedural improvements that had streamlined our investigation, and his regular status reports to Washington had kept our operation funded and supported at the highest levels. But as I dug deeper into the digital forensics, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every piece of information that had leaked to the defense team could be traced to documents that Webb had accessed in the weeks leading up to the court hearing. More troubling, his access pattern showed systematic downloading of files that weren't related to his oversight responsibilities. At 3 a.m., I made a decision that would either expose a federal conspiracy or destroy my career. I called my father. "Michael? It's 3 in the morning. Is everything all right?" "Dad, I need a favor that I can't officially ask for. I need you to issue a sealed warrant for communication records related to a federal investigation." The silence on the other end lasted long enough for me to wonder if I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When my father spoke again, his voice carried the weight of judicial authority rather than parental concern. "Son, you're asking me to potentially violate federal separation of powers protocols. I can't issue warrants for cases I'm presiding over based on requests from family members. This isn't about family, Your Honor. This is about preventing the collapse of a federal investigation that could save 300 lives. I have evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into federal law enforcement, but I need communication records to prove it." Another pause. Then, "Bring me what you have. Officially, through proper channels. If your evidence supports a warrant, I'll issue it." But this conversation never happened. By 6 a.m., I had assembled a warrant application that detailed Webb's suspicious access patterns, the correlation between his file downloads and leaked information, and the timeline that connected his activities to the defense team's unexpected knowledge of classified details. I presented the application to Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez, who took one look at the evidence and immediately petitioned Judge Fletcher for an emergency warrant. My father reviewed the application with the careful attention he gave to all warrant requests, but I could see him struggling with the implications. If Webb was compromised, it meant that a 20-year federal veteran had been selling classified intelligence to criminal defense attorneys. If Webb was innocent, we were about to destroy the career of a dedicated public servant based on circumstantial evidence. At 8:15 a.m., Judge Fletcher signed the warrant authorizing seizure of Webb's communication devices and records. The arrest happened at 9:30 a.m. in the federal building's parking garage. Webb was arriving for what he believed was a routine case briefing when FBI agents approached his vehicle. I watched from a third-floor window as the man who'd been our trusted Washington liaison was handcuffed and read his rights. The search of Webb's devices revealed a conspiracy more extensive than anyone had imagined. Webb hadn't just been leaking information to Elena Castellanos' defense team. He'd been part of a network that included a federal prosecutor in Miami, a customs official in Port Everglades, and 2 Coast Guard officers stationed at key interdiction points along the southeastern seaboard. Together, they'd been providing advance warning to criminal organizations about federal maritime investigations, allowing smuggling networks to adjust their operations to avoid detection. The conspiracy had been operating for 18 months and had compromised at least 6 major investigations. Drug shipments worth hundreds of millions of dollars had reached American streets because Webb's network had warned traffickers about Coast Guard patrols. Weapons shipments that should have been intercepted had disappeared into criminal networks because customs officials had been told which cargo containers to avoid inspecting. But the most damaging revelation was that Webb had been providing the Castellanos network with real-time intelligence about our investigation since its inception. They'd known about our surveillance operations, our informant networks, and our planned raids months before we'd executed them. Elena Castellanos had escaped the initial raids not through luck or superior planning, but because she'd been warned by a federal official who was supposed to be protecting American ports from criminal exploitation. The evidence was overwhelming. Encrypted communications between Webb and defense attorneys. Bank records showing payments from offshore accounts linked to the Castellanos organization. Travel records that placed Webb in Miami, meeting with known associates of Elena Castellanos during periods when he'd reported being in Washington on official business. By noon, we had enough evidence to not only save Operation Seahawk, but to expand it into a massive corruption investigation that would reshape federal maritime security protocols. But even as we celebrated the breakthrough, I realized that the conspiracy had been more personal than I'd understood. Webb's communications revealed that he'd specifically targeted Operation Seahawk because of my involvement. References in his encrypted messages showed that he'd viewed me as a threat to the established order of federal maritime security, a young officer whose aggressive investigative methods were disrupting arrangements that had been profitable for years. He'd engineered the leak to my father's court not just to compromise the Castellanos case, but to destroy my career by forcing me into an impossible position where I'd have to choose between operational security and family loyalty. He'd calculated that the stress of operating under my father's judicial authority while protecting classified information would cause me to make mistakes that would justify my removal from federal service. The personal nature of the attack was devastating, but it also provided the final piece of evidence we needed to secure convictions against the entire conspiracy. That afternoon, I found myself back in my father's courtroom, but this time as the lead government witness in an emergency hearing on the conspiracy charges. Elena Castellanos sat at the defense table, her confident demeanor replaced by the hollow expression of someone who just realized that her carefully planned legal strategy had collapsed. Harrison Valdez, her lead attorney, was attempting to distance himself from the conspiracy, claiming that he'd received information from confidential sources without knowing it was being provided by corrupt federal officials. But the evidence was too extensive and too specific for any reasonable claim of innocence. My father, presiding over what had become the most complex case of his judicial career, maintained perfect professional composure despite the personal implications of the proceedings. But when I took the witness stand to testify about the investigation that had exposed the conspiracy, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before: professional respect for the son he'd thought was wasting his potential. "Deputy Director Fletcher," he said formally, "please describe for the court the scope of Operation Seahawk and the methods used to identify the conspiracy that attempted to compromise this investigation." For the next 2 hours, I detailed the most complex maritime trafficking investigation in federal history, explaining how pattern analysis of shipping data had revealed criminal networks that had been operating for over a decade. I described the international cooperation that had made the investigation possible, the technological methods we'd used to track criminal communications, and the dedicated work of federal agents who'd spent months building cases that would save lives. But the most important moment came when Valdez attempted to cross-examine me about my qualifications to lead such a complex investigation. "Deputy Director Fletcher," he said, clearly hoping to undermine my credibility. "You're quite young to be directing international maritime security operations. What makes you qualified to make decisions that affect national security?" I looked at my father, then back at the defense attorney. "Mr. Valdez, I've spent 4 years analyzing maritime criminal networks that most people never know exist. I've coordinated investigations with law enforcement agencies in 12 countries. I've prevented trafficking operations that would have moved thousands of victims and billions of dollars in illegal cargo through American ports. But more importantly, I've never compromised an investigation for personal gain. And I've never betrayed the trust that comes with access to classified information." The courtroom was absolutely silent. In the gallery, I could see my mother sitting with Rebecca and David, all of them finally understanding not just what I did for work, but why the secrecy had been necessary. My father's voice, when he spoke, carried a weight that seemed to acknowledge not just the legal proceedings but the years of misunderstanding that had led to this moment. "The witness has demonstrated extensive expertise in maritime security operations. The court accepts his testimony as credible and relevant to these proceedings." It was the first time in 4 years that my father had publicly acknowledged my professional competence. But more than that, it was the moment when my family finally understood that the son they'd worried about had been protecting them, and thousands of others, all along. The federal courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the morning Elena Castellanos finally faced justice. Media from across the Southeast had descended on Charleston, drawn by a case that had exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. But for me, sitting at the prosecution table as the government's lead witness, the crowd was irrelevant. What mattered was the empty chair at the defense table where Martin Kellerman should have been sitting. Kellerman had agreed to cooperate fully with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence and the guarantee that he would regain custody of his son. His testimony over the previous 3 days had systematically dismantled Elena Castellanos' defense, revealing not just the scope of her trafficking operations, but the sophisticated network of corruption she'd built to protect them. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing payments to 12 federal officials across 6 districts. Encrypted communications detailing specific cases that had been compromised or abandoned due to leaked intelligence. Testimony from trafficking victims who had been processed through the Castellanos network and lived to describe the industrial-scale human misery that Elena's organization had inflicted. But the moment that defined the entire trial came when my father called for the reading of charges that had been added based on our investigation into federal corruption. As the clerk read each count of conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice, Elena Castellanos' composure finally cracked. The grandmother figure who had maintained an appearance of dignity throughout the proceedings began to understand that she was facing life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Her final gambit was a motion for mistrial based on alleged judicial bias, claiming that my father couldn't fairly preside over a case where his son had led the investigation. The motion was desperate and legally baseless, but it forced my father to address directly the ethical questions that had complicated this case from the beginning. "The court has reviewed its ethical obligations extensively," my father stated from the bench, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of judicial experience. "The government's investigation was conducted independently of any judicial involvement. The evidence presented has been subject to rigorous constitutional scrutiny. The defendant's motion for mistrial based on familial relationships is denied." But what happened next surprised everyone in the courtroom, including me. "However," my father continued, "the court believes this case raises important questions about transparency in federal law enforcement that should be addressed publicly." He turned toward the prosecution table, his eyes meeting mine across the formal distance of courtroom protocol. "Deputy Director Fletcher, would you please approach the bench for a moment?" I walked forward, unsure what my father intended but trusting his judicial instincts. "Deputy Director," he said, his voice now carrying across the entire courtroom, "I understand you hold a rank in federal maritime security that hasn't been disclosed in these proceedings. For the record, and in the interest of complete transparency, would you state your current position and rank?" The question caught me completely off guard. My cover designation as deputy director was already on the public record, but my father was asking for something more specific. I looked toward the prosecution table, where U.S. Attorney Torres nodded almost imperceptibly, indicating that classification restrictions had been cleared for this disclosure. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady despite the significance of what I was about to reveal. My current rank is Commodore, United States Maritime Security Command. The silence that followed was absolute. Commodore was a rank that carried weight even among people who didn't understand military or federal hierarchies. It indicated command authority over significant maritime security operations, responsibility for protecting American interests in international waters, and access to intelligence that affected national security policy. More importantly, it was a rank that no 28-year-old achieved without demonstrating exceptional competence and earning the trust of senior officials whose own careers depended on making sound personnel decisions. Elena Castellanos' defense attorney immediately objected, claiming that the government had misrepresented the credentials of their lead investigator, but my father overruled the objection with a response that surprised everyone in the courtroom. Counselor, he said, if anything, the government appears to have understated their investigator's qualifications. Motion denied. The revelation rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. Reporters began frantically typing on their devices. Court observers whispered to each other as they processed the implications of what they'd just heard. In the gallery, I could see my mother's face, her expression shifting from confusion to something approaching awe. But the most significant reaction came from Elena Castellanos herself. For the first time since her arrest, she looked directly at me, and I saw recognition in her eyes. Not just of my rank, but of the futility of fighting an investigation led by someone with the resources and authority that my position represented. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady, as he read guilty verdicts on all 43 counts of the indictment. Elena Castellanos would spend the rest of her life in federal prison. Her trafficking network was dismantled, and the corruption scheme that had compromised federal law enforcement for years was finally exposed. But for me, the real victory came afterward, in the quiet moments when my family finally understood what I'd been building toward for the past 4 years. My mother was the first to approach me as the courtroom emptied. She'd been crying during the verdict reading, and when she reached me, she placed both hands on my shoulders with a gesture that felt like a blessing. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We had no idea. We thought you were struggling, but you were protecting people." David and Rebecca joined us in the courthouse hallway, both of them looking at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not pity or concern, but genuine respect. "Commodore," David said, extending his hand for a formal handshake, "I think I owe you an apology for every piece of career advice I've ever offered." Rebecca, with her prosecutor's understanding of federal hierarchies, was shaking her head in amazement. "Do you realize what you've accomplished? Most federal prosecutors spend their entire careers hoping to work a case with these kinds of national security implications." But the conversation that mattered most came that evening, when my father and I sat alone in his study for the second time in a week. This time, however, the dynamic between us had fundamentally changed. "I need to ask you something," he said, pouring 2 glasses of the bourbon he reserved for special occasions. "When you were sitting in this kitchen 3 months ago, listening to me lecture you about career direction, what were you thinking?" I considered the question carefully. "I was thinking that you were worried about a son who didn't exist. The person you were concerned about. The aimless 28-year-old working for a consulting firm. That wasn't me. But I couldn't tell you who I actually was without compromising operational security." "So you just accepted our disappointment? Our worry?" "I accepted that your concern came from love, even when it was based on incomplete information." My father was quiet for a long moment, staring into his bourbon glass as if it contained answers to questions he was still formulating. "I've been thinking about something you said in court," he finally continued. "When you testified about the decision-making process for maritime security operations, you mentioned that sometimes protecting people requires accepting that they won't understand or appreciate the protection you're providing." "That's correct." "Is that how you felt about our family? That you were protecting us by accepting our misunderstanding?" I met his eyes across the desk that had intimidated me as a child and inspired me as an adult. "Yes, sir. I was protecting you from knowing about work that could have made you targets, and I was protecting my work from family relationships that could have been exploited by people like Elena Castellanos, but at considerable personal cost. Every meaningful job requires sacrifice. This one required sacrificing the validation that comes from family understanding. My father stood up and walked to his bookshelf, pulling down a leather-bound volume that I recognized as his trial practice manual from law school. He opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "There's something I want you to read," he said, handing me the book. The page was marked at a quote from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. "The mode by which the inevitable comes to pass is effort." "I marked that passage when I was your age," my father explained. "I thought it meant that success required hard work and persistence. But I think I misunderstood it. I think it means that truly important outcomes require effort that may not be visible or appreciated until the moment when inevitability reveals itself." He paused, looking at me with an expression that combined pride, regret, and something approaching wonder. "Your effort has been invisible to us for 4 years. But today, watching you in that courtroom, I finally understood what you've been working toward, and I'm proud of you in ways that I don't have words to express." For the first time since I was a child, my father embraced me not as a son who needed guidance, but as a man whose work he respected and whose judgment he trusted. Outside his study window, Charleston Harbor stretched toward the Atlantic, where cargo ships moved through lanes that were safer because of work that my family could finally understand. The boy who had disappointed them by choosing water over words had become a man who protected the waters that connected America to the world. But more importantly, I had finally come home. 6 months after Elena Castellanos was sentenced to life in federal prison, I received a call that would change my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. Admiral Morrison's voice carried excitement that I rarely heard from a woman who'd spent 30 years in maritime security. "Fletcher, I'm looking at your promotion orders. Congratulations, Rear Admiral." The promotion to flag rank came with new responsibilities that would reshape not just my career, but my relationship with my family in ways that none of us had expected. As Rear Admiral, I would be taking command of the newly established Maritime Criminal Intelligence Division, a joint task force that would coordinate international efforts to combat maritime trafficking, piracy, and terrorism across 3 ocean basins. More importantly, the position came with a level of public visibility that would make maintaining my previous secrecy impossible. Congressional oversight hearings, international conferences, and media briefings would be regular parts of my new responsibilities. The son who had hidden his work for 4 years was about to become the public face of American maritime security policy. The first person I called was my father. "Verpeachen pai kima, bivras coming legility, paming legility, bifrishenens." "Rear Admiral Fletcher," he said when I told him about the promotion, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "That has a nice sound to it." "Dad, there's something else. The new position will require congressional testimony and public appearances. Our family is going to receive attention that we've never experienced before." "What kind of attention?" "The kind that comes when your son is responsible for maritime security policy that affects international trade worth $2 trillion annually." The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to understand that my father was processing implications that extended far beyond family pride. Federal judges lived carefully controlled public lives, and the revelation that his son held one of the most sensitive national security positions in the federal government would inevitably affect his own judicial career. "Michael," he said finally, "are you asking for my permission or preparing me for consequences?" "I'm asking if you're ready for our family to become public in ways we've never been before. Son, I've spent 20 years making decisions that affected people's lives. If you're ready to make decisions that affect the security of the entire country, I think our family can handle whatever scrutiny comes with that responsibility." The first public indication of how dramatically our lives were about to change came 3 weeks later, when the Washington Post ran a front-page article titled, "The Judge's Son, How a Charleston Family Produced America's Youngest Maritime Security Admiral." The piece, written by investigative reporter Jennifer Walsh, detailed not just my rapid rise through federal maritime intelligence, but the Castellanos case and the corruption network we'd exposed. But what surprised me was how the article portrayed my family's reaction to learning about my classified work. Instead of focusing on years of misunderstanding, the reporter had crafted a narrative about a family whose faith in each other had survived, even when they couldn't understand each other's choices. Judge Fletcher spoke with obvious pride about his son's achievements, the article noted. But he was equally clear that the family's support for Rear Admiral Fletcher's work isn't based on his rank or recognition. "We're proud of the man he's become," Judge Fletcher said. "The rank just helps other people understand what we're now learning to see." The media attention that followed was intense but manageable. My mother, who had always been uncomfortable with public attention, discovered that she enjoyed talking about maritime security policy almost as much as she enjoyed finally being able to explain what her son actually did for work. My father found that his judicial colleagues were fascinated by the insights into federal law enforcement that came from having a son in maritime intelligence. David and Rebecca, both attorneys who understood federal hierarchies, became protective allies who helped shield our family from media requests that crossed appropriate boundaries. But the most significant change in our family dynamic came from something unexpected. I started bringing my work home. Not classified information or operational details, but the broader questions about justice, law enforcement, and international cooperation that defined my new responsibilities. For the first time in 4 years, I could seek my father's advice about legal frameworks that affected maritime security policy. I could discuss with Rebecca the constitutional implications of international law enforcement cooperation. I could even ask David about commercial law questions that related to shipping industry regulations. Our family dinners, which had been exercises in careful avoidance of topics that might highlight my apparent lack of direction, became animated discussions about policy, law, and the complex challenges of protecting American interests in an interconnected world. 6 months into my new position, I received an invitation that would complete the transformation of my relationship with my family's legacy. The Charleston Maritime Museum was hosting its annual Founders Dinner, a fundraising event that honored individuals who had contributed to the city's maritime heritage. I had been selected as the keynote speaker, and the invitation specified that the event would honor not just my work, but the Fletcher family's contribution to Charleston's legal and maritime traditions. The evening was held at the Harbor Club, overlooking the same waters where I had first understood my calling toward maritime security. My entire family was present, along with federal officials, international maritime security representatives, and Charleston community leaders who had known our family for generations. But the moment that crystallized everything came when the museum director introduced me by acknowledging the journey that had brought me to this point. "Rear Admiral Fletcher represents the evolution of Charleston's maritime tradition," she said. "Like the great sea captains and admirals who have called this port home for 3 centuries, he has dedicated his life to ensuring that our waters remain safe for commerce and open for international cooperation. But unlike previous generations, his battlefield has been the invisible war against those who would exploit our oceans for criminal purposes." She paused, looking toward the table where my family was seated. "Tonight we also honor the Fletcher family, whose commitment to justice and law has shaped Charleston for 3 generations. Judge Harrison Fletcher built legal institutions that protected our community. Judge William Fletcher has upheld constitutional principles that protect our democracy. And now Rear Admiral Michael Fletcher protects the maritime arteries that connect our community to the world." When I stepped to the podium, I looked out over an audience that included federal officials who knew the classified details of my work, and Charleston residents who remembered me as the judge's son who had chosen an uncertain path over family expectations. For the first time, those 2 worlds weren't in conflict. 5 years ago, I began. My father told me that some people are born to lead and others are born to follow. He was trying to help me understand my place in the world, but I think he was asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether you're born to lead or follow. The question is whether you're willing to serve something larger than yourself, even when that service requires sacrifices that others may not understand or appreciate. I looked toward my family's table, where my father was listening with the intensity he brought to closing arguments in important cases. I've learned that leadership isn't about commanding respect through rank or title. It's about earning trust through competence and maintaining that trust through integrity. But I've also learned that the most important leadership happens in families, where we choose to have faith in each other, even when we can't understand the paths we're taking. After the speech, my father approached me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the judicial authority that had defined our relationship throughout my childhood, not the worried concern that had characterized our interactions during my early career, but something that looked like collegial respect. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small leather case that I recognized from his study. Inside was his father's naval compass, a brass instrument that had guided ships through Charleston Harbor during World War II when my grandfather had served as a harbor pilot before becoming a judge. Grandfather wanted this to go to whichever of his descendants chose the sea, my father explained. I always assumed that would mean a traditional naval career. But I think protecting the sea from those who would exploit it counts as choosing the sea. I accepted the compass with hands that weren't entirely steady. The weight of it was more than brass and crystal. It was the physical representation of a family legacy that had finally found room for the path I'd chosen. "There's something else," my father continued. "I've been thinking about what you said in your speech, about serving something larger than yourself. I realize now that's what you've been doing all along. We just couldn't see it, because we were measuring your service by our expectations, instead of your results." That night, as I stood on the Harbor Club terrace looking out over Charleston Harbor, I understood that the journey that had begun with my family's disappointment had led to something none of us had anticipated. A deeper understanding of what it means to serve, to sacrifice, and to support each other, even when the service requires secrecy and the sacrifice demands misunderstanding. The waters that had drawn me away from my family's expectations had ultimately brought me home to their respect. The son they thought had failed to launch had actually been learning to navigate waters they couldn't see, protecting interests they couldn't imagine, and building toward a moment when his work would finally make sense to the people who loved him most. In my pocket, my grandfather's compass pointed toward true north, just as it had for ships carrying cargo that connected Charleston to the world for over 2 centuries. But now I understood that true north wasn't just a direction on the water. It was the unwavering commitment to protecting the waters that made connection possible. My family had worried that I wasn't building toward anything, but what I'd been building toward was this: the moment when the boy who disappointed them by choosing an uncertain path could stand before them as a man whose certainty about his purpose had made their world safer, even when they couldn't see the work being done in their name. Sometimes the greatest service is the service that goes unrecognized. Sometimes the deepest love is the love that trusts without understanding. And sometimes the most important homecoming happens not when you return to where you started, but when the people who love you finally understand where you've been. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.